Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about the ETH Bitcoin ratio. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. I wasn't planning on doing another video this soon on ETH Bitcoin, but I know that if I don't, everyone will say that I'm just avoiding it and not talking about it. And I've learned through the years that when you're wrong, it's best to just sort of face it head on than pretend like it didn't happen. So if you're only here for me to admit that I was wrong, then there you have it. The first thing I'd like to say with regards to ETH Bitcoin is, anything I say at this point, I know will just be seen as sort of coping, right? I understand that it's sort of a position of weakness, right? And so I can't really communicate anything about my views, especially if it's just not blindly bullish, without it just coming off as weak and defensive. So I get that. And I'm going to try to do this justice and not just look at it from only one side. But I will say, in the last several videos, there are two things that I said. First of all, if you have waited 2.5 years to trade your ETH to Bitcoin, you're far too late, right? Because, I made the trades back over here. And, I've been spending 2 years convincing people that this is what's happening. And then now there's only some people just now getting the memo. So that's why I have gone on, a couple of monologues recently on how, if you're converting now, you are really late to the game, and it does not make sense to convert it into a capitulation candle, right? That was number one. Second of all, I said that it seemed like a lot of people were converting their ETH to altcoins at the worst possible time, right? And one of the examples I gave was the Sol ETH valuation. And I said that, altcoins are oscillators at best, generally speaking. And so the Sol ETH valuation was getting really stretched. Now, there are examples where alt ETH valuations go above the range highs. So I don't want to completely discount that scenario. I'm sure that's where the pitchforks would come next. But I've just seen it a lot. I mean, I've seen a lot of altcoins do this thing against ETH where they put up a high and then they rally back up to that high. Everyone calls for that alt to flip ETH, and then it just doesn't, and it goes back down. So hopefully those views were at least helpful to at least keep you from converting your ETH into Solana at the worst possible time at the range highs, when just a few days ago, it seemed like that's what a lot of people were in fact preaching. Now, with regards to ETH Bitcoin, again, I honestly don't know how to talk about it without it coming off as weak and defensive. I really don't. So, I mean, I'm going to try, but if I was on the other side, I would be saying the same thing, right? So the first thing I will say is that, with the whole spot ETH ETF, I think a lot of people assume that I want it to be rejected, when I've said many times, even in my last video, the last video that I put out just a couple of days ago, I said, I actually hope it gets approved. I mean, I'm rooting for these things to be approved. I just think there does exist a scenario, although I know a lot of people wouldn't buy this, and I can't blame them. But there does exist a scenario where even if it is approved, ETH Bitcoin still doesn't immediately go back up to new highs, right? And so, again, I know that's not going to be a popular view, and I'm not even necessarily saying my conviction on it is like, extremely high. It's just something that I've said before, and I would reiterate that there does exist a scenario where something like that were to happen. I do want to go through kind of the pattern that we saw last time. And, I actually put out a video right here when I said that ETH Bitcoin could rally back up to around 0.053 to 0.054. And the reason why I said that was because at the time, that's where the bull market support band was, right? Right now, you can see that, in fact, we are slightly above the bull market support band. We've seen that a lot, right? I mean, we have seen that a lot. It happened back over here. It happened right here and there and there and there. All these moves were back above the bull market support band, but they all ultimately resulted in lower highs. And so I think, you really need to take out this high here for it to be more meaningful, is what I would think. But I do want to go through one scenario here when it comes to, to sort of ETH Bitcoin and what we saw in 2019, and if it is going to play out like that or if it's going to deviate. Again, first of all, I underestimated the spot Bitcoin ETF. So I'm not going to say that, that there's only one valid view, right? I think that it also, it's hard because it's like, I don't really know that many people that have been vocally bearish on the ETH Bitcoin valuation for the last 2.5 years, but anytime it rallies at all, the pitchforks come out for me, and it's a frustrating position to be in, because unless I time the bottom exactly, then, the pitchforks come, right? And I want to go through this scenario here. And honestly, this might be the last time, because it's either going to play out like this or it's not. And if it doesn't, it would be worthwhile to pivot the view. Okay. But for the last time, in case the pattern continues, ETH Bitcoin had a double peak here above the bull market support band in December of, really, the week started December 31st, but it was in January of 2019. And then it had a lower high February of 2019. To actually go look at the daily candle so that you can see what I'm talking about, this top right there occurred on January 5th. This one occurred on February 22nd. So we had a sort of a high and then a lower high. All right? January and February. So let's just go ahead and put that on here. January, February. So we have January, February, double peaks. Same thing this time, right? January, February. This was early January, just like this one was. And then the second top was late February, just like this one was, right? So you have the same setup. You have the exact same setup in terms of when those peaks occurred, January and February. And you might say, why are we looking at this? Why not look at something else? But again, my reasoning for looking at it like this is because my understanding of the cryptoverse, as ignorant as it may be, is dependent on monetary policy. It's the reason I've been bullish on Bitcoin dominance for 2.5 years, right? And when you're looking at interest rates and seeing what happened last cycle, we know that ETH Bitcoin didn't actually bottom until after rate cuts began. Again, I'm not suggesting that this time has to play out the same way, but I still think it has to be a scenario worth considering. I mean, if last cycle alt Bitcoin pairs didn't bottom until after rate cuts began, there has to be a chance that happens this time too. And then what happened is we got a move back down, and then we popped back up, and we actually had a move above the bull market support band. And would you care to guess what month that occurred in? It occurred in May. So you have January, February, and May. And then so far, we're seeing the same thing happen this May. Right? Note that when we had this move, we had a wick above the bull market support band, but then we got back below it by the end of the week. Right now, we are above the bull market support band, right? We are, clearly, just like we were back over here in February and in January, just like we were in 2019. So we are above it right now. So if this is going to play out like 2019, then you would expect the ETH Bitcoin valuation to get back below the 20-week SMA sometime in the next couple of weeks, right? Kind of like it did over here in May 2019, where it had some wicks above it, but it still mostly stayed below it, or in January, February, where you got above it, but then you still came back below it at least 1 to 2 weeks later. So I look at this chart and I say, what if it's not different? One of the things where I think if this is to play out like this, one of the things that I was looking at was this move. So I thought that move had already occurred, right? Because we had already had that move up to the bull market support band. Clearly I was wrong, even if this does play out, right? Because now we've had another move up that's actually taken out where we went right there. So January, February, May, January, February, May. Now the question, right, is will it go back down and Bitcoin take back over and Bitcoin dominance go back up? Now, one thing that happened in 2019, if you look at year-to-date ROI of ETH, you can see that it had this spike right here around May, right around the same time. And then that's where it was about a 3-day spike. It lasted for 3 days. So if you look at it on the chart, if you zoom in over there, it was, let me just show you. I hate saying like, oh, just trust me, because, I could be wrong. It's possible I'm not remembering correctly. But I believe it was a 3-day spike, right? So 1, 2, 3. 3-day spike, third day got you above the bull market support band. If you go look at it today, it doesn't really look exactly the same, to be completely honest, because we had sort of a 2-day move, then a red day, and then we're in our second day of this current move, right? So the first day was about 10%. The second day was about 5%. Now you might say, well, Ben, that's not what 2019 was, right? This is much more impressive, right? A 10% move and then a 5% move, but it's actually not. It's actually it's more underwhelming, right? These moves here were 8%, 11.5%, and 11%. Right? So 8, 11.5, and 10.5. So 8, 11.5, 10.5. So far, this is 10.5 and 5. And if you want to take these right here, that gets you about 6. But it doesn't mean, you could have another, you could have certainly it could continue. I'm not suggesting that it can't, but I do think that's an important thing to consider. Now, one thing that I've talked a lot about is our rate cuts and how that could affect things. Right now, the first rate cut isn't projected until September. And, once upon a time coming into this year, the market thought that there might be a rate cut as early as March or something. But obviously that did not happen. If you look at Bitcoin dominance, you can see that it has taken a pretty big hit. With that said, it is still above the bull market support band, right? It is. And this is one of those things where, every time it gets a big move to the downside, I never hear the end of it. And then it continues to go up. So I look at this chart and I just think to myself, it was never wrong to be bullish on Bitcoin dominance. If we look at monthly Heikin-Ashi candles, you can see that they are in still fact all green, dating back to December of 2022, right? So, Bitcoin dominance still looks how it always has, right? Now, one thing that I wanted to talk about, and it's actually what sort of led to the sort of the final drop. There was an article. Let me see if I can find it. Do you know how we've had some inflationary prints recently that haven't been that great, and you have some things like copper. So copper. Why is he talking about copper? But if you look at Let me find it. U.S. inflation versus copper. Copper tends to be a pretty good leading indicator of inflation. If it's going up, usually inflation follows. That doesn't mean you're going to have an entire second wave, but you could still see it remain sticky. And copper recently has just been going parabolic, right? So that could keep inflation from making the progress it needs to make for the Fed. So what happens if we get another bad inflation print? That could lead to more rate cuts being priced out again. In fact, it was in June of 2019. If you look at this article right here, it was in June of 2019 where the Fed said they indicate it will cut rates, but not until 2020. You see that? This was published Wednesday, June 2019. Fed indicates it will cut rates, but not until 2020. The reason why that's interesting is that was in June of 2019. And if you go look at June of 2019, that was right when ETH Bitcoin finally made the final move down. Now we are in fact approaching June of 2024. And I look at this chart and I'm like, it's not really different so far, but I am willing to admit that it could turn into something different. If ETH Bitcoin, for instance, takes out this high at 0.06, then it's different, and I should just drop the 2019 comparison. But what if this little move right here, what if that move right here is this one? Could that be the case? And, it could be, right? It certainly could be. And there's definitely a couple of ways it could happen. One of which is if Bitcoin goes on another rally. And, it's sort of the idea of like, well, the spot ETF for ETH is great and all, but it's still not here yet. And if there's still money pouring into Bitcoin, then, it could still lead ETH Bitcoin to stalling out at the station and Bitcoin taking over once again. In fact, you could argue that the liquidity from alts, because they're still staying elevated, is just more fuel for Bitcoin, right? That's one example. The other example, though, is that you could also get it on a Bitcoin dump as well. That's a possibility. The only reason I mention that is because when you look at this low here set by ETH Bitcoin, it occurred on a Bitcoin rally, whereas as this low right here occurred on a Bitcoin dump, right? So it's slightly different, right? This was on a Bitcoin rally. This was on a Bitcoin dump. And so it's really hard to know, if it's going to actually follow 2019 because Bitcoin rallies or if it's going to follow 2019 because Bitcoin dumps. I don't know the answer to that question, honestly. I have sort of laid the framework for a 2019 comparison, obviously multiple times for Bitcoin USD. And the thing that I go back to is that, in 2019, Bitcoin, it did this thing where it put in a high in June, and then a lower high in July, and then a lower high in August, right? So 3 months back to back to back. And ultimately, that rally, while it was an impressive 2-week rally by Bitcoin, it still resulted in a lower high. And so when you look at Bitcoin today, it is an impressive 2-week rally, and it very well could extend beyond. There's a lot of people that have provided a ton of evidence, and I've even provided some of the evidence. For instance, some of the evidence would be that alt Bitcoin pairs have still not broken down. Some of the evidence would be that ETH Bitcoin is back up to 0.053, so there's still fuel for Bitcoin. But there does exist a scenario where, you have yet again another lower high, just like you got over here in 2019, where, that lower high was actually a really impressive 2-week rally, but it still resolved to the downside. Again, I don't know if that's going to play out or not. We very well could break through here and go on another move. It's entirely possible. I'm not going to pretend like it can't happen, right? I'm not. And I don't know if we have enough juice to rally on through and to continue climbing. But if we do, then that would be reason enough right there for potentially ETH Bitcoin to sort of stall out for a little bit as Bitcoin takes back over. Or if Bitcoin does just put in a lower high and come back down, remember, if you look closely at the daily time frame on this, right? If you look at the daily time frame, one of the things you'll notice here is that, so if you look at the daily time frame and we overlay Bitcoin dominance, you can see that Bitcoin dominance really got this spike after Bitcoin USD topped out at around this same level, right? So it topped out at around 71, 72K. It hung out there for a few days and then it dumped. And when it dumped, that's when Bitcoin dominance spiked, right? That's when it actually spiked. So you'll notice that the last time that Bitcoin USD was at this level, back over here, the dominance of Bitcoin was actually at 54.3%. Today, it's at 54.5%. So it is slightly higher at the same Bitcoin USD valuation. So again, I look at things like ETH Bitcoin and, there's been so many of these rallies over the last several years. And every single time, like, I can't even hardly look on Twitter because of what people are saying. And there's never any accountability, for anyone else. It seems like it's just, sort of mocking me on all these rallies. I am willing to admit that, it's not like ETH Bitcoin is going to go down forever. I've said many times over the last week that it would be silly to convert your ETH to Bitcoin into the capitulation candles, right? You don't wait 2.5 years. You don't listen to me for 2.5 years, say that ETH Bitcoin is going to bleed, and then 2.5 years later, you finally make the conversion. Because here's what happens. If you convert here, then you run the risk of maybe converting back right here. And then what happens if it plays out like 2019? And then, you kind of fell for that same type of thing, right? You leave ETH here for Bitcoin, and then you convert your Bitcoin back to ETH here, and then finally it goes down. That's why I say, it's silly to do it at this point in the game. Even if my view on ETH Bitcoin is correct, and it does go down to lower levels, it doesn't mean that it's necessarily worth it. I mean, you're going to take a tax hit more than likely, depending on where you live. And, it simply might not be worth it. But I do look at sort of these patterns and sort of think about that pattern there and then this one right here. And I just wonder, like, what if it's not different? And I guess I struggle to know, like, or understand, like, why no one else is looking at sort of these patterns in general. Back over here during the spot ETF, ETH Bitcoin rallied, and I said, like, guys, this is probably just this move here, and I was laughed at. And then after, sort of going just before the halving, people were talking about the spot ETF, and I said, guys, what if this is just the second wick up, the second top? And again, I was mocked then too. And then when we went here and got a rally after the halving, and I said, guys, I don't think it's bottomed at the halving. We're probably going to go put in a lower low. I was laughed at once again. And so it's just really frustrating because there's just no outcome that I actually will feel like, was appreciated, because there's only two outcomes, right? Outcome one is it just keeps on rallying, and that's the end of it. Option two is it's May 2019 and it just bleeds into the summer, and judging by the social risk, if that happens, it's not going to matter because no one's going to be around to care about it anyways. The social risk today is essentially at a lower level than it's been at since late 2018. So there's not really a scenario that's sort of a winning scenario in my view, because again, if it just keeps on going up, then I guess people get upset because I didn't, loudly declare at the bottom. And if it doesn't keep going up, then no one's going to be here to care anyways. So I think that this is why, if you go back and watch the last two videos that I did, this is why I said it's silly to make the conversion now, because it's already gone down so much. Admittedly, I think there is a compelling case to say it could go down again. But I'm not going to sit here and say that it has to happen or anything like that. It's just sort of a probability that, look, it could be this same type of thing, right? Where you just, you see another lower high, and if it is like this, then it would probably not be believable for many, many weeks, is my guess. If you look at this spike over here in May, it did get back below the bull market support band, but then it really just kind of went sideways at right around 0.03. It's almost like the same thing. It's just that like we're 0.02 higher, right? Because this here went down to, it's actually kind of interesting. I haven't even looked at it like this before, but if you look at a price label, you see that's like 0.025, and then that's 0.035. And then look at it here, 5 years later. Sorry, let me get the actual price label. So then here you have it at 0.045 and 0.054. Kind of a very similar move, right? This is 0.025 to 0.035. This is 0.045 to 0.055 or so, right? So I look at it and I'm like, what if it's the same thing, But I know not to even read the comments. I know that because, during these two rallies over here, it was brutal, and I honestly, it was really hard to deal with the sort of the comments at the time. But we find ourselves here once again. And so I imagine that my next video on ETH Bitcoin, whenever that may be, will it'll come after we have resolution, right? It's either going to be this or it's not. And if it is, then I will just say, hey guys, this is where we were in 2019 when rate cuts arrived. Maybe it's not going to die. Maybe it's just everyone thought all these were the breakouts and they were just premature. And if I come on here in a couple of months and talk about ETH Bitcoin and this is not what happened, then so be it, right? And don't wait for me. I mean, just look at the chart. If it takes out this high, then I think it's worthwhile to pivot the view and say it's not 2019. But if it's just sort of a wick up and we go back down in a few days, then maybe the 2019 comparison isn't the worst one after all. Remember, when you think about it, again, if you look at year-to-date ROI, we saw a very, very, very similar move by ETH Bitcoin at around the same point in the cycle. So 2024 to 2019, right? And it was actually a crazy spike. I remember that spike, actually. It was really impressive. And I started my channel in the summer of 2019, and my first video on my channel, if I can quickly go find it. So my very first video, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, it feels like forever ago, was this video right here. So it was called Timing the Long-Term Momentum Shifts. Sorry, I'm trying to show it over here on the screen. So here, Ethereum, timing the long-term momentum shifts. So it was 4 years ago, but it was almost 5 years ago because this video came out, I think I published this in September of 2019. And essentially I had seen, this pattern. I saw what happened. I saw these three spikes, and I sort of recognized that people were falling for each and every one of them. And then I made that video, the oldest video on my channel, right here. And that's why I said that was the low, right? That was the timing the long-term momentum shift, was down there after I saw what happened in January, February, and May. And I just wonder if it's the same, January, February, and May. And what if everyone here is making the same mistakes that they made over here? I also will say that obviously markets are dynamic, they change. I cannot sit here and pretend like the spot ETF does not have any effect. I'm sure that it does, okay? So it's not like my conviction is 100%. Like I'm not 100% sure it's going to play out like this. I would say like my convictions are about like say 70-30, right? Maybe about 70%, 30%. 70% where it just kind of keeps playing out how we've talked about, 30% where perhaps it deviates and does something else. But I do think at this point it's fair to say that a great reason why you don't capitulate 2.5 years into a downtrend, right? This is the exact reason. It doesn't mean you can't go lower. It just means that look what happens when you do that. And if you capitulated your ETH to Bitcoin 2.5 years after I did, I did it up between 0.07 to 0.08. It's easy to look at it at 0.054 and not be very emotional about it, right? The only reason I sort of express these emotions are not because of what I feel inside. It's just what I see other people saying about me, which is hard to deal with. But yeah, I look at this and I'm like, what if it's the same? And then I look at other people and I'm like, all right, look, there's compelling reasons why it might not be, right? There are compelling reasons why it might not be. I will just say this is the reason why you don't capitulate 2.5 years into a downtrend. It's also the same reason, going back to the very beginning of the video when I said, this is why I made the video. In my last couple of videos, I've said, look, this is not the spot to convert your ETH to Solana. And I literally said it like 2 days ago, and now look at Sol ETH. Look at the Sol ETH valuation. It's just a huge rejection up here off of the top of the range. So, you really do have to be careful when you make emotional decisions based on, thinking that this altcoin's going to flip Ethereum or something just because it's been outperforming it for a couple of years or something, or a year and a half. A lot of times these altcoins are oscillators against ETH. And so to make the conversion at the range high is emotional thing. You don't trade your ETH for Solana at every point where it's been rejected at in the past. It doesn't, that's what I would say. It doesn't mean that it can't take it out. There are examples where alt ETH pairs do deviate above the range highs. There are examples of that. I could probably find, 10 easily. It's just that, is it worth the risk to convert your ETH to Solana at the same spot it was rejected at in late 2021 and March of 2024? I don't think so. And this is why, right? You get these major moves to the downside, and then you have a lot of people that converted their ETH to Solana at the top, and then maybe they spend the next 2 years wondering if it's ever going to get back to that level. So, you have to be really careful about those sorts of things. But I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Thank you guys for tuning in. And I get the sentiment. I get the comments. Say what you want to say, but I'll see you guys next time. Bye.